The sun had just risen over the land when Lot reached Zoar. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, from the Lord out of the heavens. Genesis chapter 19, verses 23 and 24. For centuries, these words were read as theological poetry, a morality tale designed by ancient desert nomads to frighten the wandering mind into ethical submission. Modern critics dismissed the narrative entirely, categorizing it as a mythological etiology, a story invented to explain the desolate, sulfurous landscape of the Dead Sea region. How could a city simply vanish in fire from the sky? But history is not built on assumption. It is built on what is left behind in the dirt. And what we are now pulling from the dirt of the Jordan Valley is not poetry. It is a forensic nightmare. We are looking at a layer of destruction so absolute, so thermally catastrophic, that it defies standard archaeological explanation. We are looking at the exact physical signature of a city that was flash incinerated from above. To understand what happened on that morning, we have to strip away the Sunday school illustrations and stand in the geopolitical reality of the Middle Bronze Age, roughly around the year 1650 BC. This was not a barren wasteland. The book of Genesis, in chapter 13, verse 10, describes the Jordan Valley, the Kikar, as being well-watered like the garden of the Lord. And archaeology confirms this with startling precision. The Jordan River Valley, specifically the region north of the Dead Sea, was a thriving, lush, agricultural powerhouse. It was the breadbasket of the ancient Levant, a massive, well-watered disk of land that supported a network of formidable city-states. The crown jewel of this network, the largest and most heavily fortified, sat on a massive mound known today as Tall el-Hammam. It was a true megacity of the Bronze Age. The footprint of Tall el-Hammam was enormous, 10 times larger than the city of Jerusalem would be in the days of King David, centuries later. It boasted a lower city and an upper city, entirely encased by a defensive wall system that staggers the modern imagination. These walls were 4 meters thick, built on stone foundations that weighed hundreds of tons, rising to a height of over 10 meters. The rampart system alone required millions of mud bricks and took generations to engineer. This was a city built for permanence. It was an economic juggernaut, a bustling metropolis where trade routes from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula converged. The streets would have smelled of crushed olives, roasting grain, and the sweat of thousands of pack animals. It was a fortress that could withstand any siege, an impenetrable stronghold of Canaanite power. But the archaeological record at Tall el-Hammam reveals a terrifying anomaly. Sometime around 1650 BC, this impregnable city, along with the dozens of smaller towns and farming villages that surrounded it, was annihilated in an instant. The destruction was so total that the entire region, the well-watered plain of the Jordan, was suddenly abandoned. It remained uninhabited, a cursed dead zone, for 600 years. No Canaanite returned to rebuild. No Egyptian garrison established a fort. The land simply died. The untold angle of the Sodom narrative lies not in the morality of the city's inhabitants, but in the specific, terrifying mechanics of its demise. For decades, archaeologists assumed that if Tall el-Hammam was destroyed, it must have been an earthquake or a military conquest. That is how ancient cities died. Walls fall inward under siege. Buildings collapse under the shaking of fault lines. But the excavation led by Dr. Stephen Collins, which has meticulously peeled back the layers of Tall el-Hammam, found something entirely different. They found a destruction matrix that military fire or tectonic shifts simply cannot produce. Across the entirety of the site, there is a thick, carbon and ash-rich destruction layer. Within this layer, excavators uncovered mudbricks that had been melted into glass. They found pottery shards that had been flash-heated so intensely that their outer surfaces had bubbled and turned to trinitite like slag. To melt mudbrick and pottery in this manner requires temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. To put that in perspective, a raging, out-of-control city fire in the ancient world might reach 1,100 degrees at its absolute hottest. A military siege using burning pitch and oil cannot generate 2,000 degrees. An earthquake cannot melt stone. What happened here was not a fire from below. In September of 2021, an international team of 21 scientists, including geologists, archaeologists, impact physicists, and mineralogists, published a landmark, peer-reviewed paper in the journal Scientific Reports, a publication of the Nature portfolio. The title of the paper was clinical but devastating. A Tunguska-sized airburst destroyed Tal el-Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age city in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea. The scientists subjected the melted artifacts from Tal el-Hammam to rigorous laboratory analysis. They found shocked quartz, microscopic grains of sand that have been fractured in a specific crisscross pattern. Shocked quartz does not form naturally on the surface of the Earth. It only forms under the incomprehensible pressures of a nuclear detonation or a cosmic impact. They found elevated levels of platinum, iridium, and osmium, rare Earth elements that are heavily concentrated in asteroids and meteors. They found melted spherules of iron and sand that had been vaporized, thrown into the atmosphere, and rained back down as microscopic glass beads. The physical evidence points to a single, undeniable conclusion. A meteor, perhaps 50 meters across, entered the Earth's atmosphere over the Jordan Valley. It did not hit the ground. Like the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908, it exploded in the air. The resulting airburst would have generated a blinding flash of light, followed seconds later by a hypervelocity blast wave superheated to thousands of degrees. This blast wave sheared the top off the city of Tal el-Hammam. The multi-ton, 4-meter-thick defensive walls were not just knocked over. They were pulverized and blown in a single, directional vector across the site. Human remains found in the destruction layer were completely disarticulated, their bones blasted into small fragments by a force that moved faster than the speed of sound. This is the exact forensic profile of Genesis 19:24. Fire and brimstone, sulfur, raining down from the heavens. The biblical text, written millennia before the invention of impact physics, perfectly describes the visual and physical reality of a cosmic airburst. We must place the human figures of the Genesis narrative directly into this scientifically verified matrix of destruction. Consider the man at the center of the story, Lot. Genesis 19 tells us that the two angelic messengers found Lot sitting in the gateway of the city. The city gate in the ancient Near East was not merely an entrance, it was the civic, judicial, and economic heart of the metropolis. To sit in the gate meant that Lot was not a marginalized immigrant. He was a man of status, deeply entrenched in the political and financial life of the city. He had wealth, he had property. His daughters were betrothed to local men. His entire identity, his legacy, was built into the mud brick and stone of this Canaanite powerhouse. When the messengers tell him to take his family and flee because the Lord is about to destroy the city, the psychological tension is agonizing. The text says he hesitated. The Hebrew word is yitmachma. He lingered, he delayed, he was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was being asked to do. To leave the city was to abandon his wealth, his status, his security, and to walk out into the unforgiving desert with nothing but the clothes on his back. His sons-in-law thought he was joking. Why would the greatest city in the Kikkar suddenly fall? It was a fortress. It was indestructible. But the messengers grab him by the hand, along with his wife and 2 daughters, and physically pull them outside the walls. The instruction is explicit and terrifying. Flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away. Genesis 19:17. The specificity of this command perfectly aligns with the physics of an airburst. The blast wave of an atmospheric explosion moves radially outward across a flat plain. To survive, one must get out of the line of sight, up into the rugged, shielding topography of the mountains. But Lot's wife looks back. This is one of the most famous and most mocked details of the biblical narrative. Genesis 19:26 says she looked back and became a pillar of salt. For centuries, skeptics have laughed at this image. But viewed through the lens of the tall el-Hammam airburst, the laughter stops. The Dead Sea is hypersaline. Its shores are crusted with deep deposits of salt and sulfur. When the superheated blast wave of the airburst slammed into the Dead Sea, it would have instantly vaporized millions of tons of hypersalty water, creating a blinding, supersonic wall of superheated steam, toxic gases, and pulverized salt. If someone lagging behind on the open plain turned to face the blast, they would be instantly hit by a thermal shockwave moving at hundreds of miles per hour. They would be flash calcified, suffocated, and buried beneath a suffocating, superheated layer of salt, ash, and debris. She did not magically turn into a tabletop salt shaker. She was incinerated and entombed by the horrific physical realities of a cosmic impact over a saline basin. The revelation here changes everything about how we read the book of Genesis. The destruction of Sodom is not a fairy tale. It is an eyewitness account of a localized extinction-level event, passed down through oral tradition and meticulously preserved in the Hebrew text. The fact that the biblical writers accurately recorded the sudden, fiery death from the sky, the specific destruction of the plain, and the centuries-long abandonment of the region, proves that they were transmitting historical fact. The 600-year gap in the archaeological record of the Jordan Valley, a period where no one farmed the land or built houses, perfectly mirrors Deuteronomy 29:23, which describes the area as a burning waste of salt and sulfur. Nothing planted, nothing sprouting, no vegetation growing on it. The soil had been poisoned by the massive influx of vaporized dead sea salts delivered by the blast wave. It took 6 centuries for the seasonal rains to wash the salt out of the topsoil enough for agriculture to return. The Bible knew the land was dead, and modern soil analysis proves it was dead and tells us exactly why. What modern archaeology has confirmed in the last 2 decades is that the authors of Scripture were not making things up. They were documenting the trauma of human history, intersecting with the incomprehensible power of the cosmos, which they correctly identified as the judgment of God. This story still matters because it demands that we confront the physical reality of the biblical text. If the fire from heaven was real, if the melted glass of tall el-Hammam is real, then we must ask ourselves what else the ancient text is telling the truth about. Abraham looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. Genesis 19:28. The smoke rising like a furnace. A massive churning mushroom cloud of ash, vaporized stone, and the memories of tens of thousands of people drifting slowly over the Dead Sea. The sun had just risen when the fire fell. A thriving Bronze Age empire wiped from the face of this earth in a fraction of a second, leaving nothing behind but melted glass, shocked quartz, and a story that the world tried to forget. The evidence is no longer buried. The stones have been examined. The heat signature has been measured. Sodom is real. Its destruction was absolute. And if the ash beneath tall el-Hammam still speaks after 3.5 millennia, what other ancient warnings are we choosing to ignore?